Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this e-Memoir session in association with NCFE. Today we're going to be looking at how to prepare apprentices effectively for endpoint assessment EPA. So we're joined by Beej Kaczmarczyk and Charlotte Freeman from NCFE. We like to keep sessions as interactive as possible, so keep the questions coming. If you're watching this on a video recording and you have any questions, all the contact details will be available at the end of the video recording. And again, I'd encourage you to get back in contact with us and also share the video recording with your colleagues. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Beej and Charlotte. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marek, and good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon, particularly to those of you that have struggled through the weather to get to wherever you are. And hopefully over the next 55 or 60 minutes, we'll be able to not only share some thoughts about the best way to prepare apprentices for endpoint assessment, but also deal with the questions that you are willing and able to pose in the course of today. And as Marek says, if we can't answer the questions in the course of the webinar, we'll make an effort to get in touch with you. Our contact details will be available in the last few slides, and we'll get back to you with answers to those questions. I'm joined this afternoon by Charlotte Freeman, who is Apprenticeship Development Manager at NCFE Cash. Just want to say a few words about yourself, Charlotte.
Yeah, thanks, Beej. Yeah, I've worked within the apprenticeship sector for the last 13 years, and I've had a wonderful pleasure of being part of the last 18 months with the NCFE. So hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions that you have today regarding endpoint assessment and us being in detail as well.
Great, thanks very much, Charlotte, and thanks very much for NCFE Cash for sponsoring the grant. What we're trying to achieve in this, and I think it's part of the agenda that we published to all of you that are listening in today, is first of all to try and demystify some of different aspects of endpoint assessment. And Charlotte in particular will be looking at that and taking questions on those key issues that you might wish to raise. But also between us, and hopefully with some help from yourselves, we'll be looking at different ways in which we can provide clear guidance and structure to help prepare our apprentices so they make the best of endpoint assessment and fulfill their potential. And I think that's something that we all obviously endeavour to do. So over the next, as I said, 55 to 60 minutes, that's what we're going to try and do with you. I think the first thing to sort of really start is just get the agenda where, you know, what's happening with apprenticeships. And as Charlotte says, over the last 18 months, 2 years, we've all been actively engaged in dealing with the apprenticeship reforms. And one of the biggest changes, clearly with the introduction of standards, is the introduction of endpoint assessment and all of the challenges, as well as the opportunities that endpoint assessment poses for us as providers, and also, most critically, for our apprentices and their employers. So there have been quite significant changes, we said. We all know that endpoint assessment is independent, first of all, so we'll talk about the benefits of that. It's synoptic, so it's a holistic approach to assessment, and it's looking at all aspects of knowledge, skills and behaviours that the apprentice has learned throughout their apprenticeship programme. So I think it's very important that you recognise that there are actually three quite important approaches in the apprenticeship frameworks. There's a holistic approach to the curriculum of the apprenticeship standard, those things that will be learnt, those things that will be applied, those things that will demonstrate the occupational competence of the apprentice. So it's a holistic approach, and EPA is part of that. There's also a holistic approach to the funding, and we know that has implications for levy-paying employers and also for non-levy paying employers. So you're being funded for the totality of the activity as opposed to being funded for separate qualifications, which obviously happen with the SAYS frameworks. And a much more holistic approach also to quality assurance and quality improvement through the revised inspection framework, which I think you'll all be aware of. Ofsted is looking at revising again, partly to take account of the move from frameworks to standards, and in particular the role of endpoint assessment and grading. And I think the key thing here is that you as providers, and it's predominantly providers and employers that are listening in today, you're going to have to work with an endpoint organisation. Clearly, Charlotte will describe the benefits of working with NCFE Cash, but obviously you'll judge between all the different endpoint organisations. And also to note that change in funding, levy paying employers, paying into a digital account, the new funding bands for apprenticeship frameworks and standards, the non-levy paying employers who are required to find 10% of the cost of training and assessment, and of course the introduction of the public sector apprenticeship targets, where every public sector organisation with 250 or more staff will have to ensure that 2.3% of their employees a new apprenticeship starts, and that's between last April and the 31st of March 2021. Clearly that's identified new markets for you, schools, local authorities, central government departments, NHS as well. One or two things don't change. We've always had the requirement for 20% off the job, and that's obviously not including English and maths. But of course, that's had a key impact in the way in which that's being perceived by employers and the way that we as providers can sell the benefits of the job training and what it adds to all the different aspects of the training and assessment of the apprentice. So some key things there that are part of this reform program and process. As we said, standards are not qualification led as the SACE frameworks were, and that's partly because of the issues that some employers and certainly employers had about the value of some of those qualifications. However, it's important to note that there's a recent update and new guidance from the Institute for Apprentices about qualifications, and I just want to quote to you. I think it's important. It says a mandatory, remember we've always been able to include non-mandatory qualifications in any deal that we've had with an employer under the standards, but you couldn't use the funding band to pay for that. That would be something that you'd ask the employer to pay for separately. But for a mandatory qualification, it can be included if it is an off-the-job technical qualification that does not accredit full occupational competence and would either add breadth to the apprenticeship or provide structure for the off-the-job training. So to some extent, this is responding to a concern that many employers had who wanted to see qualifications inside the standard, inside the apprenticeship. The appointed endpoint assessment organisation will obviously claim the apprenticeship standard certificate, so there's a change in the processes. All of us have had to go through the register of apprenticeship training providers, and it's not just about being on the register of training organisations, which I think has raised quite a lot of issues, but also to be aware of the impacts of some of the changes in rules affecting subcontracting and the relationship between a prime and a subcontracting partner, which is now seen much more as a form of partnership where the main provider and the supporting provider share the delivery of the training and assessment between them and make sure that that interaction and that relationship is totally driven by the quality of experience for the apprentice and their employer. So I think there's some important things there that set, if you want, the scene. Why are we having independent endpoint assessment? Well, I think one of the key frustrations, and it came through in the Richard Review, was that if we had continuous assessment of qualifications, that was really quite useful in accrediting and recognising achievement in each skill in isolation. But it didn't really demonstrate in the round what that young person or that adult was capable of doing in terms of occupational competence. So there was that was obviously that frustration. Also, the continuous assessment in the workplace by assessors was also seen as quite bureaucratic and quite costly in terms of the amount of time that was being taken up. So the Richard Review brought a lot of these frustrations and obviously a move away from the very detailed bureaucratic occupational standards, checklists and box ticking approach that was as part and parcel of that, and suggested that we needed a different way of assessing apprentices, and that obviously is very much driven by the demands from employers, not only to have more say over the content and design of apprenticeships, but also the way in which apprenticeships were being assessed. So the key thing here is that the endpoint assessment is being carried out by organisations that's independent of the training provider, that meets quality criteria to be allowed to go on the register of endpoint assessment organisations. And obviously the key thing there is that these organisations, as we said, are independent of the training provider and also of the employer. So how is endpoint assessment developed? You're all familiar with this model. The assessment plan is developed by a trailblazer group that includes the representatives of the employer. That's supported by the Institute for Apprenticeships. Once that plan is approved and published, then you know what you as providers are working to, along with your employer partners. And then obviously you have to have an endpoint assessment organisation. How that's approved goes through the register we talked about. And then obviously that organisation develops the assessment materials, and Charlotte will be looking at that in detail. And the endpoint assessment organisation is responsible for the internal quality assessment, but we also have other organisations, and there's basically 4 models, but it's not the theme of today's, which are responsible for the external quality assurance and making sure that outcomes for apprentices who do the same apprenticeship standard are standardised and moderated across the whole of the sector. And then obviously the endpoint assessment organisation is responsible for making sure that the endpoint assessment that the apprentice experience is one that fulfills the requirements of the assessment plan. So that's the sort of, if you want, the basic shape. And in terms of what the role therefore of the endpoint assessment organisation, and Charlotte will develop that particularly with NCFE Cash, is to do all of those things we've just described. It's developing the content of the endpoint assessment. What structure does it have? What kind of different assessment tools are we using? Agree, obviously, critically here, the cost of the endpoint assessment, because obviously you, the provider, have got to enter into a contract with the endpoint assessment organisation, and the employer's got to know what proportion of the training cost, whether it be, you know, £900 or £1,000, I think that's quite critical. The endpoint assessment organisation also responsible for recruiting, training and managing those independent assessors. And don't forget, some of those independent assessors could be the on-programme assessors from a different provider working with different apprentices, but also to make sure that the apprentice has completed all that's required to be done before the endpoint assessment. The conduct of the endpoint assessment, Charlotte will talk about, and that's the responsibility of the organisation, as well as the internal quality assurance. But, and I think this is the assurance that we're all seeking as providers, and of course as users, as employers, is that this is all subject to external quality assurance in terms of standardising, moderating, etc., and ensuring consistency and value is the same across all of those learners that might be following a particular standard. And of course then they identify and record when the apprentice has passed the endpoint assessment, and then obviously complete the process with the apprenticeship certificate. So that's a sort of, if you want, a few words of introduction to what I'd call the general knowledge around endpoint assessment. Charlotte, at this stage, do you want to say anything about any of the points that I've raised so far?
I think you've covered everything really clearly there, Beej, unless we've got any questions on those aspects.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions before we move on. One from, I think it's Eileen. Some awarding organisations are employing staff from deliverers to endpoint assessment. How do they maintain the distance required?
Okay, should I take that one, Beej?
Yeah, if you could do.
So yeah, we currently are recruiting for our independent endpoint assessors, and they will go for a very rigorous recruitment process to make sure that their currency and their skill levels are to the required standard to assess for each different standard. So it's not just one straightforward recruitment that we can do. We have to obviously make sure that the currency is tailored to the specific standard that they would be assessing, and then train them up so that we've got that national standardisation. The way that we're making sure we sort of manage conflicts of interest, which I believe that's possibly what that question is regarding, is the way that our assessors would be inputted into our SEPA platform, where we're working with smart apprentices, SEPA's platform. They will have to input a level of information about themselves, about where they work, where they have worked historically, and what their CPD level is. And when the apprentice comes through Gateway, they will also have an awful lot of different information in them. And the better way of explaining it is the apprentice will come with lots of different flags of information, and the IEPAs that are plugged into our system will also have those flags of information, so that when the apprentice comes through Gateway and they're matched up with the IEPA, we are controlling those conflicts of interest and maintaining that independence, and that the correct IEPA is selected and matched to that apprentice. And I'm sure other EPAOs will be managing that aspect as well themselves.
That's a good question, good answer there, Charlotte. There's a further point from Lee. How is the endpoint assessment quality assured and standardized? Well, we talked about the external quality assurance organizations. I think there are 4 organizations that are being commissioned to do that work, Charlotte.
Yeah, there's Ofsted, which is naturally one of them that is involved in the QA process. Then there's other different sector skills bodies that are set up. So our Skills for Health or Skills for Care, I always get the two mixed up, are doing some of the adult care and the health care. Then there's other different EPAOs or EQAs, sorry, out there that are getting set up. For us, there will probably be more than 4, because there's trade body associations, which means that that's grouped as one of the 4. But it can be multiple different trade associations that are involved in that particular arm. So the EQA, or the management of EQAs at the moment, is probably one of the most challenging, if I was being honest, from an EPAO side of things, because we're being asked for lots of different things, for different standards. From an NCFE cash point of view, what we've done is we've taken the absolute straight level quality and applied that to all of our standards. So for some EQAs, we might be doing over and above what we need to do, but at least it matches what we're being asked from the most, if you get what I'm saying. So from a quality point of view, we're making sure that we have that rigor from a quality side of things. Our IEQA process, I think, is what will ultimately feed into our EQA visits, and that's the structure that we've developed as an EPAO to make sure that we're maintaining that internal quality and that we can control and standardise that on a national level. And what we will do, because this is so new, is everything will be double marked. So when you get an assessment from one of our independent EPAs, when they're assessing your apprentice, that will always be double marked by somebody in the beginning, until we can then sign off people's experience levels through standardisation meetings. Very much like you as training providers will do with your assessors now, kind of that RAG rating and that flagging of your red and your green and your amber assessors. We will go through that process with all of our IEPAs as well.
That's a really good answer. Thanks, Measure. And the point, by the way, I was making about the 4, it's the 4 types of EQAs.
Yes,
it's not 4 EQA organisations, it's 4 types, and Ofsted obviously is one of those, and I think the Institute for Apprentices as well, isn't it? So you could have different.
Yeah, that out, haven't they? Beej?
That's
so,
right.
Yeah.
That's right. And just in response to that question about the new guidance from the Institute for Apprenticeships about mandatory qualifications, what they're saying is that non-mandatory qualifications have always been eligible for you to offer under an apprenticeship standard. It's just that you couldn't use the funding band to pay for it. You would have to ask the employer. Say the employer said, look, I think this enhances the value of this apprenticeship with my staff. Then if they wanted a qualification which was not mandatory, not part of the apprenticeship standard, they were always able to pay for it separately, but that was not part of the use of the digital account, or not part of what would be subject to the 10% contribution from the employer. So I just wanted to clarify that. So just looking at the assessment plan, Charlotte, would you like to develop that for us now?
Yeah, so I thought this was really useful, because ultimately we're moving away from that qualification framework of delivery that the state frameworks give us in the new world of standards, where there isn't a mandatory qualification and there's a recommendation, or like you say, there's the choice that the employer may want a qualification in there. But if you ultimately choose not to deliver any qualifications, the standard itself will assess that learner's skills, behaviours and competence to that particular standard, and they get the end certificate. I think the assessment plan now is the replacement of a qualification specification in this world. It's your starting point to be able to plan your on-program requirements. So for me, the assessment plan is the first point of reference where you can go to and, one, determine whether there is a mandatory qual or not. Two, it's that length of program duration. And this is where I get questioned an awful lot of, when can a learner actually progress through Gateway? And your assessment plan will tell you the minimum duration that apprentice needs to remain on program training before they can continue or progress through Gateway. And in most cases, that's around that 12, 18 or 24 month mark. So that's all detailed within your assessment plan. It also covers the core elements of what will be assessed at endpoint assessment, and what units, almost, if you was to bring it back to the language of a qualification, will be assessed by different components. So it'll help you be able to plan and prepare for your delivery a lot easier with the full knowledge of that assessment plan. It's obviously going to tell you as well what needs to be assessed and how it will be assessed when you come to endpoint assessment. And ultimately, it's giving you that core information about how that particular standard will be graded and weighted. If we have an awful lot of standards that are out there at this moment in time, but if I was just to take one for an example, if you were to look at the assessment plan for customer service practitioner, there's 3 different components within that particular standard. And what the assessment plan will tell you is the weighting of the showcase or the apprenticeship showcase is 65%. The practical observation is 20% and the professional discussion is 15%, which is really, really useful information when you're building your on-program design with your apprentice, and also what focus you then put on in terms of mock assessments and what tools you will use to prepare that apprentice ready for that end assessment. In that assessment plan as well, it gives you that detail, which is where you would have normally got it from your qual spec, as in internally, what skill levels do you need for your trainer or assessor or whatever name that individual is going to have in this new world, because I think Beej touched on it earlier on the slide. It is a different role that the assessor would now be having, because they're not doing that continual assessment to say whether the apprentice has passed or failed at the end of a qualification, but they will play a vital role in skilling that apprentice with mock assessments and summative assessments at the end of unit delivery, so that they're skilled when they come through Gateway to tackle endpoint assessment. But all of that really useful information in order to plan your on-program designs is all there on the ESFA website in the standard assessment plans. And it's those assessment plans that all EPAs will be using almost as our starting point for developing endpoint assessment.
A question there, Charlotte. It's from someone saying, they're just new to this. They'll be very familiar with frameworks, but not standards. Does the assessment plan also indicate the relative weightings to things like the assessment tools that might be used in the EPA? You mentioned 65% for the. Is it different for each standard?
Yeah, unfortunately, there isn't a standard approach to standards, and every standard is different dependent on what that Trailblazer group has determined was the best for that particular industry, really. So if you were to take any of them, the team leader supervisor at level 3, there's 4 components within there, and in the assessment plan, it'll tell you what those 4 components are, and it will also tell you what weighting each of those components has, and it will also then go into the detail of, for each component, how that individual component will be graded. So if I break that down, for team leading, there's 4 components that is detailed in the assessment plan. What it tells you is the percentage of each of those components. So if I take one of them, which is the portfolio, that's worth 20%. And in the assessment plan, it even breaks it down further, and it'll say, in that portfolio, it's worth 20% of the final marks, and you must score a minimum of 10 marks to pass it. So there's 20 marks that you can get for that portfolio. It's worth 20% of the final grading, and you must score 50% basically on that portfolio to pass that portfolio. So you have to have half of the marks. So it goes into that really, really detailed level, your assessment plan.
Just and a further point, actually, it's on the team leader. We got a question on the team leader. And is it a requirement over the 4 elements that they get a minimum of 50% on each one of the 4 elements?
So I'm just having a quick look through now. So for the portfolio, it states that there's a maximum of 20 marks and the minimum of 10 marks to pass. So that's out the 20 marks, they must get 50%. For the knowledge-based question test, there is 30 marks available and they must score 15 to pass. So that would be 50%. So that's a yes to that one. For the competency-based interview, there is a maximum of 30 marks available and you must score 15. So that's another 50% to pass. And the professional discussion, again, there's 20 marks available and you have to have 10 marks available to pass. So yes, for the team leader, there's 4 different components. They're weighted slightly differently, so they're not all equal. So they're not all 25%. They're different weighting values, but when you actually do the component, you must score half of the marks available for that particular component to pass.
That's right. And I think for that particular one, is it 70% and plus that gets you a distinction?
Sorry, Beej, you broke up there. What was that question?
I think the question there was, to get distinction, would they have to get something around 70%?
That's correct, yeah. So it's 50% for a pass, 60% for a merit, 70% for a distinction.
We got a question here from Eileen, thank you. What's the difference between a showcase and a portfolio?
That's a really good question, Eileen. In the next slide that we've got on that, I've kind of broke down all of the different, or tried to summarize the different types of assessment components that the Trailblazer groups are using over various different standards. But the main difference, a showcase is where they have to do a portfolio, but they will also have a discussion with the independent endpoint assessor about that portfolio. So they will have a discussion about the evidence that they've submitted within that portfolio. So it's not just a marking of the portfolio, it's a discussion as well for them to basically highlight the core points that they want to bring to the eyes of the IEPA. Whereas when it's just a portfolio by itself as one of the components, it literally is just the marking of that submitted piece of evidence.
And another question from Yvonne, thank you. The questions are coming in, by the way, thick and fast. Can centres IV work that is going to be used at the gateway or for the gateway process?
So yeah, this is all about how to prepare your apprentice. I can only talk in the eyes of NCFE and CASH from an endpoint assessment point of view, but what we've done is we've done guides. If there's a portfolio in there, part of our support resources is that we've done a comprehensive guide for that portfolio element. What we've said is that they're only suggestions and they're only guides, so it's not that you must follow them, but we've said a recommended number of pieces of evidence that should be submitted as part of that portfolio. And this is just taken from the assessment plan. We've just kind of interpreted it for you guys to try and make it a little bit easier as training providers to tackle and do your planning and also prepare your apprentice. What we will have then done is broken down the modules that will be assessed by that portfolio. Again, we've just taken it from the assessment plan, so we're not making anything new up or changing things. We're just making the guidance easier for you. And then what we will have done is shown how the marks are attributed and given examples of evidence that would come from a merit or a pass or a distinction apprentice. Therefore, before you submit that portfolio at Gateway, you have the ability to be able to cross-reference that to those guides, and you can make a judgment call as to whether you believe that that portfolio would pass or be a merit or be a distinction before you submit it at Gateway. My advice to you is that if you think that that portfolio isn't meeting that criteria, then your answer is that that apprentice essentially isn't ready for Gateway, and they would need to go and do some extra work to make that portfolio Gateway ready.
And that's a good point, Charlotte. Actually, it's our next webinar is on that, isn't it? About how to prepare people for the Gateway. But I think there's some really good points there.
It is, yes.
So let's have a look at the different types of assessment that might occur during endpoint assessment.
Yeah, so this is, I've tried to summarise. I'm not saying this is an exclusive list, but and the question that kind of just picked that up on there is in terms of the first one on their portfolio assessment. there has been given lots of different names depending on the standard around the portfolio assessment. So, for example, the customer service practitioner has used the apprentice showcase because they don't just want it to be a marking of a portfolio, they want that interview discussion to happen as well, where other standards have just done it as a simple portfolio. But ultimately, portfolio or a synoptic portfolio, that's being used in some of the health and adult care standards as well, which is like a summary of evidence to enable a discussion to occur with the apprentice. So portfolio kind of is a wide assessment tool that's being used by lots of different standards. Some of the standards also include interviews, whether they are one-to-one interviews that are conducted between the independent EPA and the apprentice, or when you get slightly higher level standards like the ops manager at level 5, departmental manager, there's panel interviews that are involved in that, where the employer is involved in that panel interview as well. You've got professional discussions. Professional discussions tend to be the final component in most of the standards that NCFE and CASH are doing. So it might be different in other sectors that we're not touching on, so I can only speak about the standards that I've naturally read and reviewed. But there is a sequential order that in the assessment plan for some of the standards. So some of the trailblazer groups will have indicated that certain components need to be passed and achieved before they can go on ahead and tackle a third component within there. So if I come back to that customer service practitioner as the example, because I've used it already, the 3 components that is involved in that standard, the apprentice showcase and the observation, both need to have been completed before they can do the professional discussion. And in most cases, when the professional discussion is being used in the standards that we're assessing and being EPAOs for, it is the final core element, and it's more of a final element or a final chance for them to establish that skills and behaviours of that apprentice. So it could be a grading judgment call where in previous components, the apprentice hasn't necessarily been able to showcase their skills in a particular area. And the discussion then is the chance to be able to have a further discussion to establish the apprentice's skills around that particular component. I've just lost signal. So we've also got observations that are part of one of the components, end tests as well. And the end tests are variant. Some standards are using simple multiple choice questions. So it's just a question with 4 possible scenarios. Others have also built in short answers that form part of that end test as well. And that'll be fully controlled by the EPAO, dependent on whichever standard or which endpoint assessment organisation you select. That in the assessment plans, there's very specific criteria of how we have to build those end tests. So for the adult care level 2, they've been very specific in the assessment plan to say that there is 60 questions that need to be submitted in that end test, that the end test needs to last for 90 minutes, and the end test must cover various different subject areas. So there is very strict guidance of what EPAOs must be doing to be able to build these end tests. Projects as well, so there's various different standards that have a project where you'd be set a synoptic project and you must go away, work on it, and that needs to come back and be reworked on or submitted to the IEPA to be able to be marked. Then you have some of the very specialist ones, like your culinary challenges that are in the commie chef, senior chef standards as well, where I've kind of got that in my head when I'm talking about them, like a ready, steady, cook challenge, because it's almost like provide a bag of ingredients and then the apprentice has to provide and demonstrate their knowledge, skills and behaviours of being able to present and return back a meal after these particular ingredients have been presented. There are CPD logs and discussions in that, again, that's slightly higher level at the level 5, where they would have to log and show evidence of CPD in their particular area. And presentations have been used as well in some of the standards that we're dealing with, where the apprentice will have to present back to the IEPA. Some is where it's on a set topic, others it's where they work with the employer to determine what topic area that presentation will be done on. But very, very broadly, and this is more about the standards that we've looked at, so there could be more, it's not an exclusive list like I say, but this is generally the themes of what's getting picked. And some standards they will pick 2, Others, they've picked 5 components. So this is where I go back to my previous point. The assessment plan really is your first place to go to find out how your standard has been built ultimately and what comprises of that standard endpoint assessment.
Charlotte, there's a flood of questions, and that's really helpful, because I think the key point you're making there is that, you know, the different standards might use 2, 3, or 4, or even 5 of these different types. But we've got some, Raj has asked the question about how, in your view, will all of this change the role of the assessor? And I know that we've been doing a fair number of webinars on the changing role of the assessor, but certainly in response to Raj's question, I think it changes it fundamentally to be much more to do with teaching, learning and assessment. And then clearly that raises issues about whether some of your assessors have got the skill set, the training and the CPD to be able to do that. But the focus is much more on the provider being involved in making sure that the teaching, learning and assessment, the off the job and the on the job, is really well integrated, and it isn't just about assessing that the person has completed the task. It's what's the knowledge, what's the learning, what's the skills, what's the behaviours that particular task is highlighted. Would you agree with that, Charlotte?
Yeah, I do. I think it's really, really valuable that you continuously assess. Ultimately, you're not making that final judgment call anymore. The role of the assessment, you would make that final judgment call, but you need to be skilling your apprentices. So regular and continuous assessment needs to take place. But yeah, there is definitely a huge discussion about what your role is, and I think that teaching, learning and assessment is definitely key to guide that apprentice now, because most of these changes have come about because it was felt previously it was more of a tick box exercise to fit the requirements of a qualification, and not necessarily to fit their skills, knowledge and behaviours of a particular job role or a sector.
Yeah, and Lee's coming in with quite an important point. We're still making workplace observations by assessors, collecting evidence for the apprentice's portfolio that is then IQA'd against the criteria from the Trailblazer criteria. Does any of this count towards the endpoint assessment? I know what Lee's getting at, but I think the critical answer here is that it's about how well you prepare the person. But does any of the work that you do on the on-programme actually make a contribution in any way towards the what I'd call the final grading on endpoint assessment? For example, the project. What happens if the project starts before the person goes on to endpoint assessment?
Yeah, it does. So I think for different standards, it does vary. Because if I was to take the adult care ones, the learner throughout their journey, there's a mandatory qualification within that. So it's probably one of the areas where your job role as an assessor is changing the least, because you've still got to deliver a mandatory diploma qualification throughout the delivery of that particular standard and build your portfolio of evidence for that qualification, plus assess the care certificate. But what you need to do for endpoint assessment is within that last 3 months of your learning journey on that on-programme is guiding that apprentice to build a synoptic portfolio, which is evidence that they will build with yourselves, but submit at Gateway for the IEPA to mark, and that does go towards the market evaluation for that particular standard. Likewise, you've got the customer service practitioner, sorry to keep on using that one, but just to keep continuity through the discussion, the showcase is a portfolio that they should be building. This minimum duration is 12 months on programme, training and delivery. They will probably be developing, I would imagine, and everybody will do this differently, but continuous portfolio evidence. But what the Trailblazer group has suggested within their assessment plan is that final submitted portfolio to the endpoint assessment organisation would be built in the last 3 months of your on-programme delivery, so that you're getting the best of the best evidence to be able to showcase the skills, behaviours and knowledge of that apprentice. So that they'll build, because they need to get into the experience of building a portfolio continuously throughout the journey. The portfolio they submit to the endpoint assessment organisation ultimately will be built in the last 3 months. So I hope that answers the question.
That answers, I think, in part the question. Eileen's just added it. I think that's something that actually hinted at there seems like a lot of the forms of evidence are still very much like qualification light tasks rather than trade tests. I think the point you made at the very end there about making sure that the last 2 or 3 months of preparing the portfolio is actually also saying, yeah, and you've got to be work ready. You've got to be able to perform quite significant practices and tasks to a standard that is accepted by the industry and by the sector.
Yeah.
So I do think that's important, rather than just simply tests of just knowledge and understanding. They've got to be application of the skills, as well as demonstrating the appropriate behaviours to the standard that's the professional standards required. So I think it is actually raising the ante as well on the actual portfolio, isn't it?
Yeah, completely, because in most of the standards that we're dealing with, there is that professional discussion, and that discussion is ultimately an assessment of, can this person actually do that job? If they were to go away, am I confidently being able to get the feel of this apprentice that they could go away and go and perform within this particular industry? And that's really very, very different, I think, from the last 13 years that I've been in the delivery of apprentices, because it's been very focused on ticking box, almost an exercise, not necessarily all the time, because they're still obviously conducting the job with their learner mentor, but fundamentally for a STACE framework, it was, have they got all of the evidence required for that particular qualification, so that when I'm externally moderated, when my awarding body comes in, I can showcase the evidence that they've hit the requirements of that qualification. Whereas the shift now is that are they competent in order to go and do that job?
Yeah.
And am I getting that feel from them when we're having that discussion? Absolutely.
So what sort of things are you offering in terms of gateway support?
So from NCFE Cash, so over the different standards that we are delivering for, we've developed a comprehensive support material to prepare that apprentice, essentially, and aid you as training providers to prepare that apprentice for Gateway, which means that for each of the components, what we will have done is a comprehensive guide. So it's unique to every standard, but they will give written support if it was, like I was saying, for the portfolio. It will give full guidance of what will be assessed for that one, what will be marked, and what evidence they're looking for to hit for that particular aspect or that different component. And it'll detail how it will be marked and how it will be graded. If there is an end test that's involved in there, then we have produced a written end test, so it's available for you to see, to do a mock test with, but also in order to guide you to write end of module tests as well, so that you can understand the language and the content that's being used within those end tests, and that you can then formulate your own end module tests as well for that apprentice as they go along their learning journey. Where we've got standards where there is a project, then we will obviously provide the guidance around that project brief. So in some cases, the employer and the apprentice would go away and work on what they want to submit as their topic areas to the IEPA. So we've got guidance about how to pick those topic areas. If it's where it's an actual project that we need to give you, so that it's a set topic area, then obviously you'll have that guidance of what will need to be fulfilled in order to return for that particular project. We've also got full topic areas explained in terms of what their learning outcomes, the skills, the knowledge, behaviours, what will be covered via an observation, or what will be covered by the different components in there. And if this is a mandatory qualification, we've mapped it comprehensively as well, so that in the adult care, there is the care certificate, and then there's the mandatory qualification. And we've mapped our diploma to say this is where you would be hitting the skills, the knowledge, and the behaviours of the specific standard, but also by using the qualification, this is where you would hit the evidence required for the care certificate as well. There is a guide for the apprentice, which wrote specifically for to share with the apprentice or the employer. And then there's one for you guys as the training provider, so that you can also start at the very beginning to say, right, this is the first piece of evidence that you'd need to kind of pick up, if you will, in order to plan your own programme. So it's your first guide of saying, this is what's involved in that particular standard, this is how it's going to be marked, this is what this area is looking at, this is what this component's going to look at. And then if there's any template guidance that we think that has been appropriate for that particular standard, we've developed those for you as well. So for instance, within the synoptic portfolios or the or the larger portfolios and showcases, where there needs to be reflective journals. We've done a template for a reflective journal and give a full understanding and guidance of how to complete one of those. Where there needs to be employer statements involved, we've done guidance for the employer as well, so that you know fully how you complete an employer statement and a template for one of those. So we believe we've given a comprehensive support pack in order to prepare the training provider whilst you're doing your mock assessments or your end of modules assessments, so that you can tailor them so that they're similar to the endpoint assessment modules, but also for the apprentice, so that they fully understand what's expected of them throughout their journey.
That's really the really comprehensive answer there. And can I just add, just for points of independence, of course, check this out with whichever endpoint assessment organisation you're using to make sure you get the same level of service. Raj, I hope that answers your question about the availability of the templates. Lisa, you've made a good comment there, which I think is a really useful thing about developing standards within your company, and it's a good way to look at it. It's like learning to drive. The tutor assessor works with the learner as a driving instructor does, and then the EPA is the testing centre. She's found that a really useful way of looking at standards. I think we've met that sort of model before, Charlotte.
Yeah, definitely. I think also in the teaching world as well, that this isn't new to the teaching world, because a lot in that environment, they're trained by one particular training organisation, and then they're assessed by somebody independent to them, and that's been happening for a long time. And I think the apprentice model is almost sort of mirroring what's happening in that particular sector as well.
And the question from Sue: are the Gateway support packs available on the NCFE website now?
They're available if you engage with us as your selected endpoint assessment organisation. So if you select us and say that you want to work with us, or more importantly, your employers have selected us and they wish to work with us, then you do need to sign an agreement to work with NCFE Cash. That's more of a funding requirement, because there's obviously a transfer of public money, that we need to have an agreement in place that you're using us as your EPAO. Once you have signed to that agreement, you'll get access to the platform that I mentioned earlier, that we're working in partnership with Smart Apprentices, the SEPA platform, and that houses all of our gateway guides and all of our policies and procedures. So in terms of reasonable adjustment, anything in terms of appealing a grade, or anything that could possibly need an answer for in terms of endpoint assessment, is all housed in that platform. So once you sign an agreement, that's ultimately your key to accessing all of that information with NCFE Cash, but it's not openly accessible, the gateway guides on our website.
Yeah, I can understand that. Actually, this relates to something you just said about reasonable adjustments. Justine's just posed a good question. And again, it's about making sure that any endpoint assessment is fair, it's consistent, and it takes account of circumstances. If a health and social care learner is so nervous they can't present themselves well during a discussion, is there any opportunity for the independent endpoint assessment to see them at work to help with the discussion and take into consideration, bearing in mind this is very much a hands-on industry? Is that built in, do you think, into the way in which endpoint assessment organisations organise the availability and the support for individuals that might have, as you said, difficult circumstances?
Yeah, I can only talk about how we're approaching it, and I would imagine that every other EPAO would have a different way of how they've built their unique models, because we'll all have different models and different ways of how we've approached it. Our strategy is a digital model where that professional discussion would be done remotely through digital technologies. However, our reasonable adjustment is that individual, especially within the health or the adult care sector, if they have a requirement because of maybe the lack of technologies, or it is just through your assessments that they require reasonable adjustment, then that can be requested 3 months before that gateway submission, where we would do that face-to-face if that was what was assessed and evaluated to be the outcome that particular learner needs, in order not to disadvantage that learner. But, and I will caveat that, the learner does need to do the professional discussion in the way that the Trailblazer has deemed that learner needs to be assessed. So there is quite and I kind of go back to that assessment plan, there is very specific guidelines of what that professional discussion what needs to happen and how it needs to be conducted and what needs to take place in order to evaluate and give the apprentice the acquired grades and points. So I would say this is all about that coaching and preparing of those learners, and those learners where they need a little bit more guidance. I think it's that evaluation of when they are gateway ready. And it might be that you need to work with that type of learner for a little bit longer than the standard 12 months in order to be gateway ready.
And also, I think a good point there to note is to don't forget that, you know, all those learners that might have other individual needs is the availability of learning support, and that can involve extra coaching, etc. for them. So what sort of, what are you an approved EPAO for which standards?
Yeah, so we're on the register now for 12 standards under our NCFE brand, and then 7 under our cash brand. And if we go on to the next slide, it's probably easier rather than me kind of just talking at you. I have listed all of the standards under each brand. So in front of you now is all of the standards that are under our NCFE brand and that were approved on the register under the Skills Funding Agency. So I'll pause so that people can kind of read those for yourself. And then on the following slide, we have all of the cash approved standards. So on the top half of this slide, because it's a little bit cluttered, are all of the ones where we're on the approved register because they have actually been released from the Trailblazer group. I would imagine there's lots of people that are on the webinar today that are waiting for the early years educator to be released and finalised. Likewise, we are with bated breath. So once that is released under the cash brand, naturally being sector leaders in the early years educator is that we would have the intent to put in our application. Naturally, we have to go through the application process that you explained earlier, Beej, but we definitely are going to give our commitment that we will put in an application for that early years educator once released for the level 3, level 4, level 5. And we also know that children, young people and families manager and practitioner, the level 4 and the level 5, are at Trailblazer stage now, and they've still not been released. So as and when they are released, we have an avid interest of applying for those ones too. And sort of future developments under the cash brand, it won't be within this academic year, but definitely for next academic year, we are interested in developing or looking into the business case for the teaching assistants at level 3 and the teacher at level 6, but no full decisions have been made on there, but that's kind of future view of developments. And
go on, sorry.
Sorry, Beej, go on.
Just before you go on, there was a question, another question, which actually I was going to come to later on, but never mind, I think it's important. It appears that the training provider still has a significant role to play leading up to endpoint assessment. But how's the cost of endpoint assessment being set in proportion to the funding available? I think that's a good question, because obviously one of the big issues we've always said is that endpoint assessment shouldn't take any more than 20% of the total value in that funding band, which could be in some cases 20% of 27,000. I don't think, I mean, from your experience, Charlotte, that I think we've actually fallen into these sort of different models almost by accident, you know. And I know I've been talking to some endpoint assessment organisations that say that it's costing somewhere between £900 and £1,000 as long as there's no complications, no resits, etc. But that's a sort of ballpark figure based on having a large number of people turn up at one centre at the same time. Any thoughts or comments?
So yeah, naturally we've got the funding rules that we need to take into consideration, which is the 20% cap that endpoint assessment can't cost more than that if it's to use public money. If it does cost more than that, then that has to be something that's negotiated and the employer pays that difference if it is over the 20%, I believe is the wording in the funding. The way that NCFE and cash have approached it is we know that that's there, but we've not based our model around the 20% in mind. What we've done is we've costed it out in terms of what the components are and the requirements of the assessment are. And I'm sure every other endpoint assessment organisation has approached it this way, because as a business, I'm sure when you're costing up your delivery models, you start at the very beginning. So you look at the costs that are going to be incurred to deliver that model. And that's all we've done as an endpoint assessment organisation, is we've looked at the cost to develop it, we've looked at the cost to train our IEPAs and to maintain and standardise the quality on a national level. We've looked at the cost of being able to maintain those resources to make sure that we refresh the question sets where there's end tests and refresh the training when we're conducting professional discussions and observations. And then obviously the fundamental cost of any of the different licensing models or digital technologies that we've brought in. And ultimately that has been done in quite a comprehensive cost model. And that has told us what price our cost should be for endpoint assessment in order for us to be able to cover the costs that we're going to incur. If that's gone over 20%, that's when we've had to kind of come back to the drawing board. But in most cases, our prices are all under that 20% because we've wanted to stay eligible to that 20% funding rule. So we've not gone over the 20%. What we've done is we've just taken the hit, for the want of a better word, if there has been instances where the endpoint assessment does cost more than 20% to do it. There are others where we're only at 10% because when we've done our costing model, that's been the fair and reasonable price to charge for endpoint assessment.
That's a good point there, and actually it's a comment from one of our employers. It's difficult to decide because they have to decide which endpoint assessment organisation they use, and then obviously the training provider contracts with them. They say it's very difficult when we're trying to compare what they're offering and what price they're offering. How do we make those choices?
I think that's always been the case with any service that you're selecting, really, and I think it's the same in this instance. And the fact that this is so new as well, I think that's going to be the hardest decision for you. So I completely empathise, but I firmly believe the service level that you're getting is what needs to also be considered into that. So on the slide previously, it was there about our history, and it's all that experience and history that NCFE and CASH have collectively together in a world that isn't endpoint assessment, and applying that knowledge of internal quality, applying the knowledge of us controlling qualifications for the last 170 years as an awarding organisation for external quality assurance, that we believe it's those added value bits that we have within our organisation that would attract people to selecting us. Ultimately, the price is set because it's been set on a cost model. So what we've tried to do is enhance that with our gateway guide.
And a good question as well. And I think obviously you're offering very much the same sort of support for the provider as demonstrated in that model there.
Yeah, I think we've all naturally will any organisations, so all endpoint assessment organisations will have their own unique elements to their delivery model or what you will get as part of the service that they're offering you. And I think now's the chance where ultimately, in order to make your decision, is you need to really see what everybody else can offer. Because it's so new, that's the only way you're going to fundamentally make your decisions now on which EPAO to go for. And it's not always, because I use this frequently and my husband will laugh, it's not necessarily always about the price, especially because it is so new. So if you select an EPAO because of that confidence, because of that history, and because of the additional guidance that they're able to provide you, that they cost a little bit more than that. Actually, that cost might work out in the long run because the guidance is there to help you along the way.
I think that's a good point there, and actually that's what one of the people has just commented. It's not just about price, it's about the all-round service that you offer all the way through the stages to for the training provider and their apprentice to make sure that they are really ready for the endpoint assessment and successfully negotiate it.
Yeah, completely, Beej, because what we didn't want to do is we could have pulled our price down, but if we did that, then we would have had to make compromises, as everybody is commercially aware. You can't do everything for a particular price. And this word that's been around about negotiating, if we negotiated, then there's bits of our standard service that would have to also come out when you start to negotiate those prices. You can get it to this, but you would lose this as that compromise. So discussion. But for us, I think we're really proud of our price. We think we've got it fair, and also that we've got that wider service as well in order to support the apprentice, the employer, and you guys, the training providers, for this very, very new assessment.
And I think the key point that you're making is that what you're offering, hopefully when people are making those choices, they're looking for similar service level agreements, you know, everything from the online digital platform, the centre guidance, you know, the mapping, etc. And obviously the things like the sample resources. One of our colleagues was asking for, you know, those templates, and that's why your answer was really satisfying for that person.
Yeah, and naturally, obviously, I work for NCFE Cash, so I'm going to say it anyway, but I'm really proud of what we're offering. And we've done a lot of listening over the last 18 months. It's not that we've just kind of developed what we've got now. Over the last 18 months, myself and my team, we've been out talking to lots of training providers and asking what it is that you need, and what would you like it to look like. And that's really what shaped our offer. So I think it's quite an intuitive offer that we've brought to the market as well, in order to help and guide in this very new early days.
And we've got a good comment, by the way, Charlotte. Someone says, I've just used all the stuff that you've offered there, and I'm going to use that as my criteria for judging how good other endpoint assessment organisations are. So we've been of service.
I hope I've made the bar too high then, and that you will ultimately select us.
But I think you've made the comment that that's the sort of criteria you should be applying. It's not just using one criteria of price. It's how good is the all-round service, you know, the one-stop shop, as we call it, that you're going to get from the endpoint assessment organisation. So we're really thanks for that.
And it's the confidence as well of them IEPAs that are going to make them judgment calls and that assessment as well. So I think that's fundamental in your decision as well, is what training and what's the background and what's the experience of that EPAO in order to be able to train these individuals that are going to make that summative judgment on your apprentice.
Yeah, it's a good point, because again, what I say is one of the requirements really we're making of employers and training providers is to make sure that they understand the service level agreement that the training provider is contracted to the EPAO on, to make sure that all of those things are delivered consistently. And I think that's one of the expectations of the training provider and the employers, to make sure that all of those things that are in the service level agreement are actually delivered and delivered consistently.
Yeah, and it's because it's so early days, we've done that. So from Gateway, what we've said is the first attempt, it'll be 8 weeks to complete the different components maximum. That's what we're saying. Again, that's first attempt. But over time, once we've got more learners that are going through Gateway and doing the assessment, ultimately where we want to be in 6 or 12 months' time is to be able to put an SLA on each standard. So for the adult care, because there's 2 components involved in that, that might be actually a lot less than 8 weeks. So until we've got the data, we can't make them very specific or tailored to standards. So what we've used is our wealth of experience from awarding and gone, yeah, we're pretty confident that 8 weeks is about right on average for all of the standards at this starting point. So they're like our promises to you, because as training providers, you need to now complete your individual learner plans for your apprentices. And you need to now start to factor in is you've got on-program delivery, that's start and end, but you've also then got endpoint assessment that needs to be achieved before you submit your end date onto an ILR. And that's kind of where we've given that guidance around the 8 weeks for first attempt.
And a good point, one of the questions is that, I think what we're going to say here is that what each endpoint assessment organisation is doing to differentiate with itself will be working on a given set of criteria, because the external quality assurance, we expect you all to apply the same criteria. It's how you deliver them and the value that you add to them. I think that's the critical issue here. So I don't think we're saying that, there won't be the same criteria. There'll be the same criteria, but it's how that endpoint assessment organisation interprets and adds value to it. As you said, in terms of very simple things like being able to match, for example, if the person who's going for endpoint assessment is using a completely different technology from what's being used in the endpoint assessment, that's not appropriate. They've got to be technology that they're familiar with. We've got to make sure that there's certain criteria that are applied there. But that's really helpful. Have you got any other points just to make there, Charlotte, before we move on to the sort of conclusion?
No, Beej, I know that I can talk an awful lot, and I've probably kept everybody up from a time point of view, so I'll hand back over to yourself.
And I think that's really useful. Again, thanks very much, Charlotte, for sharing that with us. What I just wanted to just sort of pull back together, because remember, hopefully we demystified the endpoint assessment process. But what we also wanted to make sure is all the way through is to say how to make sure that we can effectively prepare our apprentices for that experience. So I think just summing up, I can see some critical success factors. And the first of these is we've really got to get the active involvement of the employers very early in the process. So this isn't something that happens at the tail end. They choose what the endpoint assessment organisation is going to be, but also they've got to be actively involved at the very beginning in understanding the requirements of the standard, in planning, scheduling, preparing, and of course in some endpoint assessments they're actually going to be participating. As Charlotte said, they could be actually observing tasks, or they could be on an expert panel. I think we're also really saying that, you know, in response to some of your questions, we're not really dismissing internal quality assurance by the training providers. All those things you've done to assure quality, consistency, etc., and the support that we're expecting apprentices to get, even in the new world of EPA, is still critical. I think a key point that everyone's been making is we've all got to understand the real cost of the EPA process. And I think, as Charlotte said, it's early days. And, you know, we're maybe just finding a way from a cost plus model, but I think there are going to be some more things to do. And certainly my expectation is that it's got to be really reflective, not so much of a 20% sort of rule, because that was almost an arbitrary figure. It's actually what is the real cost, particularly when it comes to that for some of the less, you know, the band 1 and 2 standards, the cost of endpoint assessment can be disproportionately high, and that's the point you made. I think what's critical here is the recruitment, training, standardization and moderation of assessors must be effective. That's of the independent assessors. And I think we've also got to make sure that almost recognizes what Charlotte said, that if we're going to get the quality of outcomes and the quality and the adherence to good quality professional criterion standards, there's got to be some dedicated CPD, and that's what each endpoint assessment organization is doing. I think they've got to be flexible, because when you're working with employers, it's like saying that, you know, we'll do this endpoint assessment this week. Well, no, we can't, because we've had a major flood or we've had a big order, and it's understanding the business cycle as well. I think the good points that you've made, we're going to pick up in the next webinar, is how important a robust gateway process is that's there to take account of all the things we talked about, you know, different rates of progress, different situations in which apprentices find themselves in, the criticality of the role of the assessor tutor. But for me, the most important thing is that all the people who are partners to endpoint assessment, that's people like Charlotte's organisation, you the training providers, you the employers, and the apprentices have got to know everything that is relevant and the expectations of the different roles. And I think we've said that, you know, the worst thing is to have apprentices who are not aware of how the endpoint assessment might pan out and not aware of what's required of them in terms of preparation for endpoint assessment. So I think there's some big issues there. And I would certainly sort of try to pull this together by saying that in terms of the expectations of you, the training providers, you've got to have all the things that we talked about there, you know, that the apprentices have a good understanding of what endpoint assessment looks like and are prepared for it. Mock, what do you call it, assessments, mock question and answer, mock interviews, etc. But I think also in response to that question about the care, one of the care apprentices, we've got to be able to prepare and support apprentices, particularly who might be new to this form of assessment, with the pressure and stress of the endpoint assessment experience, a bit like preparing people for the driving test. I think we've got to collaborate with the EPAOs to ensure that the delivery that we have and the approach we have matches the assessment plan. And you made that eloquently this importance of how everything is driven by the assessment plan. But also, I think we've got to expect from CASH and from NCFE, CASH and any other EPAO that they supply us with the information that we need in a timely and clear fashion and that employers need. And I have got a real concern about compatibility of systems with the learning technology that apprentices might, you know, you said we might have digital this and digital that, but we've got to make sure that whatever it does, the learning technology is one that the apprentices are already familiar with. And that might create some extra cost and issues for the EPAOs. I think all the arrangements for research, complaints and appeals, you covered that really well, Charlotte, are in place, and they are communicated effectively to apprentices and the people that support them. So some good messages there. We've got also expectations of the employers, and I know employers are still listening in, thank you. You've got to engage with the EPA organisation early. You've also got to make sure that you make sure that the training provider and the EPA organisation stick to what's in the service level agreement. Support and prepare the apprentices to make the most of the process, particularly the gateway. But I think also you as the employer and your staff, your supervisory staff, your workplace mentors have really got to understand how well the apprentice is progressing and celebrating their success and making sure that they're ready for the what do you call it, the gateway. And I think making sure that that two-way process is there with the training provider, what's happening from the point of view of the training provider and what's happening from your point of view as well. So is there anything else you want to add, Charlotte? I know we've gone well over the hour, but we have a lot of questions, by the way, still on, but not on, they're actually to do with English and maths. Any information about, what do you call it, any information about the, oh yeah, sorry, any more information about English and maths?
So what was the specific question about the requirements of English and maths?
Any updates on learners having to register and take a level 2 functional skills in English and maths, even if they don't pass? Surely all these failures would not look at Ofsted inspection. That's a more general question, isn't it, about English and maths?
Yeah, I think, yeah. I think the answer to that, Beej, is in your funding guidelines, because the funding guidelines for standards just state that the learner needs to be working towards a level 2 qualification or recognised maths and English qualification. So ultimately, how I would interpret that, and that this is my interpretation as an individual, would be that they would need to be enrolled towards a level 2 qualification. And they must have attempted that, therefore your evidence would be a pass or a fail at the attempt of that qualification at level 2 English or at level 2 maths for Gateway.
Yeah, I think that's a useful point you've made there. I think my expectations certainly are that in terms of, you know, preparing apprentices effectively, I think the expectation, you know, those critical success factors and all the points we raised about, you know, the assessment plan and the assessment plan being well understood and making sure that the apprentices actually understand that features very highly in those critical success factors. So hopefully, you know, you're picking up the key messages there, as well as the expectations of training providers and employers. One thing just to note, that it's something I just picked up recently, is that there are some opportunities, obviously, for our assessor tutors, our workplace tutors, to, of course, take on this dual role of being an on-program trainer and also an endpoint assessment assessor for different apprentices, because I think that is my sort of final point about preparing apprentices effectively for endpoint assessment is, can we make sure all the people, as many people as possible, who are working with them on a regular basis through visits, through the off-the-job and on-the-job training, and bringing those together, actually, if they are also involved taking on the independent EPA assessor role, then they will get a better understanding of the expectations of endpoint assessment, grade boundaries, and all of the different forms of assessment that might be used within a particular standard. Do you think that's a good point to sort of end on there?
I do, Beej, because I think before, when I was talking to you about in the teaching assessment, so the HLTA assessments or high level teaching assistants, how they predominantly have been assessed historically is that they would have been trained and then evaluated and assessed by somebody independent to that training. It does kind of shape what's happening now in the apprenticeship world, and they tend to cross over like that. You'd have one trainer that would deliver, and very much like that driving school analogy, is the learner would then come to the the assessment centre of HLTA and then be reassigned somebody that hasn't done their training, and they kind of cross over. And we definitely, within our recruitment model for IEPAs, are looking at either partnering with significant centres and providers and doing it from a centre to EPA sort of partnership working. But we also have advertisements out now there for those individuals that have the flexibility to be able to do our work as well as the day job work as well, in order to come and work with us directly. So we have those vacancies out there as well.
Oh, that's good then. And I think when, in response to one person's question, we will supply you. There was a question about, can we find out more about the webinars you've been running on target setting and feedback in how they would help apprentices to prepare for endpoint assessment. They'll help the apprentices to cover all the aspects of the apprenticeship programme. We'll make those available certainly at the end, and if not today, we'll give you the link details, and Mike will arrange that. Well, that's wonderful. Thanks very much, then, Charlotte. Thanks very much for all of your questions. And if there's any other things you want to know, obviously get in touch with us at our contact points. As we said, we've got another session on how to help employers with the gateway process, which I think we'll be doing soon. I think we've had a great comment. Thanks very much for clarifying all of those issues for us. Obviously, we know that sometimes we overdo some of what I'd call the funding issues. I know that. I tended to do that. But I've got a great comment from Lee, or from one of our colleagues, sorry. I feel that the NVQ route was better. Well, we always hark back to the good old days. And it's interesting because obviously when you looked at the development of NVQs, it was very much more about that sort of, it wasn't about checklist and tick box. It was about much more reflection on what you do and what you do well in planning the next activity. But we'll come back to that. Thanks very much then, Charlotte.
I think I agree with you there, Beej, totally. I think it's what was perceived in the people that did the reviews, that it was a tick box. I don't necessarily agree that was what was being done in delivery or out there.
Yeah, and I think Marek, if we thank everyone, thanks so much for the questions. We have so many questions that hopefully we've gone through as many of the answers as we can. We'll now close down the recording.
Yeah, I'm just closing the recording just to let you know that I'll be providing you all a copy of the video recording and the slides, and it'll probably come along some point in the afternoon. Just need to do a bit of digitisation. Again, thank you to the absolutely fantastic questions that came through from participants. You would not believe how hard Beej was working in the background there to go through the sheer volume of there, and also Charlotte. They were coming thick and fast, so really appreciated that. If you're watching this on the video recording and you've got any questions, please get in touch. I'm going to close the webinar now. Thank you.